Hello. Can everyone hear us? Can you hear me at the back? Can you hear me at the back? Great. Okay, we're going to get started. I'll just get a cough out of my throat. Well, welcome everybody. I'm really glad that everybody's here. I'm really glad that we're having this talk today. I've been a volunteer with IMI for 4 years, and I love it when we have opportunities to have conversations like this about things that are not spoken about enough. I work in my day job as a clinical psychologist with children who are gender non-conforming, and so it's often that this issue is very personal and vocational, I suppose, to me when I'm working with Muslim families, and not just thinking about Muslim, but thinking about religion, thinking about heritage, and thinking about how we think about and understand gender. So I think it's something that we just need to keep talking about and keep moving forward as a community. So today I have the great pleasure of introducing to you Leyla Jagiella, who has come from Germany. She's a cultural anthropologist who teaches on the study of religion. She's an activist working for an organisation called LIB, which is Liberal Islamische Bund. I don't think I got my finger. My German's not going to be good. Thank you. She's been an activist for 2 decades now and has been doing workshops around the issue of orthodoxy and hetero-orthodoxy in Islam and South Asia. And I'm really excited to hear what she has to say today. I've read some of her work that she's written a while ago, and she's a brilliant writer, and I've spoken with her over lunch, and I'm really excited. As with this morning, it will be the same. There'll be a short talk, and then afterwards there'll be opportunity for questions, which I'll start things off, and then it'll be open to the floor.
Hi, can you hear me? Oh, great. Okay. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. No. Can you? This is a bit irritating sometimes. Okay, I'm excited actually. This is really nice to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me here and listening to me today. And if you, I don't know, what was the title that I sent you last minute somewhere in the program? Did people read it actually? So the title of this talk is supposed to be "What is Islam even?" Which is a little bit, it's actually a little play on a very heavy and academic book that came out a while ago with the title "What is Islam?" by Shahab Ahmed, who has been talking about the big break that happened in our Islamic consciousness. Shahab Ahmed is not so much interested in sexuality and gender, but in general he speaks about the big difference in thinking that we as Muslims nowadays have and that Muslims in the past used to have, which actually I find, it reflects a lot on our thinking about sexuality and gender as well, and I'm trying to talk about that a little bit. I'm going to start with a story. I'm going to retell it out of my memory, so it might not actually be 100% true to the original written source, but please trust me that the main important points were not made up by me, but this is how the story was originally written. It is a story that was published in the 17th century in the Ottoman Empire. The author was somebody called Nevizade Atai, and he was a poet. He published a collection of storytelling poems, which had the title Heftan in Ottoman. And the most popular of these stories is a story of 2 young boys. The one was called Tahir and the other was called Tayyip, who grew up in Ottoman Istanbul, and Atay gives us an image of how Ottoman Istanbul looked like in his day and age, and how young people from, good families would have enjoyed their life at that time. Now, before I'm going to get more into the story, please keep in mind we're in the 17th century now. In the 17th century, sexual ethics were definitely different from how we would like to have sexual ethics now. There was a different musing and sometimes also a total lack on ideas such as consent, for example. Things such as slavery were part of everyday world. And relationships between people, whether it were heterosexual or homosexual relationships, were often seen or were expected to be hierarchical relationships. They were not, equal relationships. So let's just accept this for a while. There's a lot of critical stuff that we can say about this, and I might actually touch upon that in the workshop that I'm going to do later in the afternoon when it comes to talking about sexual ethics. But let's just keep that a little bit aside and just accept it that this was how people at that time largely thought about sexual ethics. So Atay tells us the story of these two young men who enjoy life very much. They come from so-called good families. They are very wealthy. They spend their days in the meyhanes of Istanbul, in the wine houses, playing music, having a lot of friends around them, and they are very, very popular there. Like, friends gather around these two boys and love to spend time with them. After a while, these boys, they probably were not very good at managing their finances. So at some point they realized that they don't have, the money is just not there anymore that they used to have. And they realized the more they have less to spend, the less friends they also have around them. So apparently their popularity was very much based on how much money they spent and how much they, created parties and invited people and paid for their drinks and all of that, which pushes them into a little bit of an identity crisis, because suddenly they realize that they don't really have anybody in life, and that all they had was just based on their money that they had and their social status. This crisis turns them into spiritual thinkers, and they decide, okay, apparently all this stuff of this world isn't worth it, and it's better to dedicate your life to a spiritual purpose and search for God. And so they decide to join a Sufi order, and there was one particular Sufi order which was very popular at that time, which people nowadays barely know. It was the Gulsheni Sufi order, which had its center in Egypt. And so these two young men decide to travel to Egypt. They board a ship, but unfortunately the ship gets caught by European pirates. The European pirates take the two young men, Tahir and Tayyib, into captivity and sell them as slaves at European slave markets. It's, by the way, quite interesting that we have this kind of story from 17th century Ottoman Empire, because we have very similar, fears and ideas and stories from the Christian West from the same period, about Muslims capturing Christians and so on. So you see, actually, that was an age where these two sides mirrored each other very much. So they were sold into slavery in Europe, and they were bought by two different lords. The one was, the original writing is Ottoman, but we see that the Ottoman writing tries to mimic European names, and we can guess that the name of the one was maybe John, and maybe he was British, and the name of the other one was Gianni, and maybe he was Italian. They were both Christians, they were both Europeans, but they come from different parts of Europe. One buys Tahir and the other one buys Tayyip. Now we get into a part that is a little bit challenging to our ideas of sexual ethics, because we are told that these two men, John and Gianni, were very good slaveholders. They were very nice slaveholders, and they were also very nice human beings in general. And they loved these young men that they bought also very much, because they were very nice young men. And after a while, relationships develop between, on the one hand, John and Tahir, and on the other hand, Gianni and Tayyip. And they fall in love with each other. This is told to us very casually. It's nothing special in the 17th century in the Ottoman Empire to talk about something like that. Now, John notices that Tahir seems to be very much in love with him and very happy with him, but there's something that bothers him. And because John loves Tahir very much, at some point he asks him, what's going on with you? Why are you so sad? And Tahir tells him his story about his friend Tayyip, who has been sold to another person somewhere in Europe, and that they have been separated, and that he was his best friend, and that he would so much like to see his best friend again. And so John takes the effort of locating Gianni, and he actually manages to find Gianni. And he manages to create a reunion of, these two couples, basically. And then the author Attai describes to us how these two couples actually enjoy life together, and it goes on over a few pages, how they together then frequent the wine houses and listen to music and are happy in their mutual embraces, and the one couple is there and the other couple is there. Apparently that there's slavery doesn't really matter very much. But then a dark cloud appears at the sky, and the dark cloud appears in the form of an evil, bigoted Christian who says that there's something wrong there. This is not good. These two male couples, they shouldn't enjoy their happiness, and that's against nature, and that's against religion, and that's something that's not good. We are given the image of a very, this Christian appears as somebody who's very, very much how maybe nowadays certain Muslim fundamentalists are portrayed, So here we have a mirroring maybe of our current situation there, where the Christian world is described and presented as the intolerant world, where such love cannot thrive. And this evil Christian then brings the whole affair to the court. And the two boys are, they are sold to some ship where they are supposed to row on the, the galley, something like that. And the two Christian men, John and Gianni, are thrown into prison. In prison, John and Gianni are longing for their lost slave lovers, and through their love, they interestingly come closer to Islam, and they consider converting to Islam. And at night, they suddenly see a dream in which the Prophet Muhammad appears to them and opens the door for them and removes the shackles for them. And when they wake up, indeed the shackles are gone and the door is open, and they escape. Meanwhile, the two young men, Tahir and Tayyip, are on that ship where they are supposed to serve. But then another ship of pirates comes and captures them, and this time it's Muslim pirates, and they liberate the two boys and make sure that they can come home. The story continues for a while. John and Johnny escape from the prison. The two boys, Tahir and Tayyib, still search for John and Johnny. At some point, they encounter each other, and they all decide to go back to the home of the two young men, to Istanbul, and live there all together happily ever after. This is basically the summary of this story. This story from the 17th century was one of the, you could say, the bestsellers of the Ottoman Empire. It was a story that was read by everybody who thought of himself and probably also herself as an educated person, and it was just extremely, extremely popular. If we think of this story, the kind of details that there are there, we have these homoerotic relationships there, which in itself are not very unusual. Actually, throughout the whole period, we have literature was centered on male homoeroticism, actually. But what indeed seems a little bit unusual is that with this homoeroticism, we constantly have religious themes mixed in. You know, the whole story starts with the young man trying to find some meaning and sense in life. They want to become Sufis. They want to become part of a dervish order. In between, we have this part where John and Johnny are in prison, and they have a dream of the Prophet Muhammad, and then they are freed. And all of that in the service of this homoerotic love story that is served to us. Which is, when we think of it in our terms nowadays, it seems a little bit confusing that a story like that could be so popular and so easily received in Islam, because we nowadays struggle much more with such themes. And even if we are aware of these parts of our heritage and our history, and I'm sure a lot of you in the audience are aware of this. I mean, this is something, a lot of work has been done on uncovering all of these traditions in Islamic history, that even though we know there is this heritage of a more relaxed approach towards homoeroticism, a more relaxed approach to gender diversity in the Muslim past, we still struggle with understanding how people in the past were able to reconcile this with their faith and their religious identities. There are a lot of other examples that I could cite to demonstrate that. Maybe, I guess a lot of you probably have heard the name Abu Nuwas, right? I see a lot of people nodding, but just for those who have not heard the name Abu Nuwas was an Arab poet in the 9th century who is mostly known for quite scandalous homoerotic poetry that he wrote. And this poetry was also considered one of the, like the kind of literature that you had to know if you consider yourself an educated person in the Muslim world. One thing that a lot of people do not know about Abu Nuwas is that Abu Nuwas was actually a teacher of hadith. That was his everyday job, And he was actually considered a very reliable teacher of hadith. I mean, there was a discussion on him that, some families would say, we don't think it's very good to send our teenage boys to this person because it might lead to complicated situations. This guy writing these raunchy poems on young men. But in general, it was not considered anything unusual that somebody could write these kind of poems while at the same time the same person could be a teacher of hadith. It's a very regular thing. What has happened in our history that has made us so unable to understand the kind of mindset that Muslims in the past lived in? What has happened that we find it so difficult nowadays to reconcile these different parts of our heritage, while Muslims in the past just considered it a very regular and normal thing, you know? There has been a lot of analysis done. What? No, I messed up my sentence, sorry, but you get my point. There is a lot of analysis out there on that, and a lot of this focuses on colonialism and on the influence of modernity. In fact, the book that I mentioned before by Shahab Ahmed, for example, that focuses on that aspect, the impact of modernity on Islam and how it has made us incapable of really still living and celebrating that kind of heritage that we used to have in the past. I definitely agree that colonialism and modernity are the culprit here, but I would like to look at what happened inside of us. I mean, what was the internal process that this caused, and what exactly was it that was different about our mindset as Muslims back then? And you cannot only you do not only need to look at sexuality and gender to see what was going on there, but we can look at a lot of examples of how in some sense the Muslim conscience and the Muslim consciousness has lost a very important spiritual core. I give you an example that has not immediately anything directly to do with sexuality and gender, but that has a very strong bearing on sexuality and gender as well. There was a Turkish Sufi poet in probably the 13th century, although the specialists disagree a little bit on when exactly he lived. His name was Yunus Emre. I'm sure some of you must have heard his name. His poetry is very, very popular in Turkey, even until today. And one of the most quoted sentences of Yunus Emre is one where he says that respecting human feelings, making sure that you do not hurt a single human heart, is much more important than whether you go on Hajj to Mecca or whether you pray 5 times a day or anything like that. It's a very widely quoted sentence by Yunus Emre. Now, exactly the same sentence also shows up in the poetry of Bulle Shah, a 17th century Punjabi poet. And it is very well known amongst, let's say, rural Punjabi Muslims. And the idea behind that sentence is also very much, it has ingrained itself very much in the conscience of a lot of South Asian Muslims, and you will find the same idea repeated over and over. You find it even quoted to some extent in filmy songs in very contemporary times. There's a song, I think from the 70s or 80s, which has been quite popular in that regard, that has the refrain, Allahi Allah kiya karo, dukh na kisi ko diya karo, which means, just remember the name of God, just be conscious of God, and do not give any pain to anybody. This is all that's important in Islam, basically. And this is an idea that you can find still a lot of people mention to you when you ask them what is important to you about Islam, even nowadays. I've heard exactly the same sentence, the sentence of it's more important to respect human feelings and to not hurt a human heart, quoted to me by intellectual Muslims in Java, in Indonesia. And I've heard the same sentence also quoted by a Sunni Muslim scholar in Syria to me. So here we have totally different historical contexts. We have 13th century Anatolia, Turkey. We have 17th century Punjab. We have modern day Pakistan. We have modern day Indonesia. We have a Muslim scholar in Syria. But they all know this central idea, this central sentence. So we can with a lot of confidence say that this is actually a very, very basic Muslim idea. It is as widespread as the 5 pillars of Islam. It is as essential and central to Islam, but we have forgotten to center that idea. We do not center it anymore. Imagine we would center that idea. What impact would it make? What impact does it have on all these discussions that we have here? You know, on sexuality, on gender, on sexual ethics, on all of that. If we understand, basically, it's more important to not hurt a human heart than any of the central pillars of Islam. It's very sad that although a lot of us still have this kind of knowledge, and a lot of this knowledge still exists in many different parts of the Muslim world, we constantly still fall back into that format of thinking where we are unable to center these things, and instead we are asking, oh my God, is this fully halal what I'm doing, or is this haram, or, you know, I'm always falling back into these kind of, I mean, Ghazala connected it very much in her talk to the idea of the mutashabihat in the Quran. You know, always we fall back into this, I would even say it's a neurosis of focusing on the secondary things in Islam instead of keeping the focus on what is essential about our spirituality. I think in the end, this has a lot to do with our image of God, with our own idea of who God is and what God is. Because if you really understand the God of our faith, as Ghazala has explained it to us today, as a God of mercy, then how can you always end up focusing on these secondary details and not on essential ethical ideas or love and mercy in general? How can you believe in a merciful God on the one hand, and on the other hand be convinced that, I don't know, that maybe it matters whether you pluck your eyebrows or whether, you know, your nail polish is what you call this, like it lets water through or not? It's, you know, if you look at the classical writings of a lot of Muslim scholars, you see that they had a very different attitude towards knowledge different from the kind of attitude that we have today. Ghazala was also saying in her talk that, okay, Ghazali is definitely not my favorite thinkers. There are a lot of things that are problematic about him, but there are some very, very brilliant points that he makes. And when she said that, I was like, I wanted to say the same, basically, although my example is a very different one. Ghazali is mostly, nowadays, a lot of people criticize him because he is blamed for shutting down philosophical discussion in Islam. I mean, that's at least a viewpoint that some people have had. It's actually wrong, and there has been a lot of criticism of that viewpoint as well. But what is true is that Ghazali criticized one particular idea of philosophy that was very much represented by Ibn Rushd in his day and age. And Ibn Rushd was a rationalist scholar who was convinced that everything in faith can be understood by human reason as well, and it has to be in harmony with human reason. And Ibn Rushd made a lot of good points on that, and it's really interesting actually to read Ibn Rushd. Ghazali does not want to say that reason should not be used, or that we should not employ reason to understand faith. In fact, he himself has ideas of a very specific rationalism, and he's at some point says something that might even be a bit shocking to us Muslims today. At some point he said, doubt is essential to faith, because you first have to doubt and then you come to knowledge, actually. So he is interested in reason and in rational processes. But what he says at some point is that we as human beings are incapable of fully understanding the divine through our rational faculties. And we have to accept that. And that also means that whatever position we take, and Ghazali himself took a couple of very, very strong positions, actually, and some of them are very uncomfortable. But still he says, whatever position you take, please be aware of that your personal faculties of reason and your knowledge is very much limited. In theory, as Muslims, we know that idea. I mean, even in Salah, or especially in Salafi and Ikhwani circles, it's very popular to always say Allahu Alam after everything you say, you know, always acknowledging, but God knows best, but God knows best. But it has become very much a phrase and not really something that we are consciously aware of, that whatever we think, whatever position we take, whatever opinion we take, it is relative, and we cannot claim to know anything 100% for sure. It's just impossible for us as human beings. And this idea has been elaborated upon a lot in classical Muslim thinking, and it has Muslim civilization, which is a problematic term, but I'm just going to use it that way at this point, made very aware of the fact that the highest reality, God, and everything that flows from God, can actually be understood by different ways, and can actually be, you know, give us something through different sources. And it's not just the Quran, or it's not just scripture that informs us of truth, that informs us of divinity, but there are many, many other sources as well that we can tap into. You find that idea actually in the Quran itself, when the Quran says, the words, you all know this, I'm sure, the words of God are so, you know, are so uncountable that even if the whole ocean was ink and you would use it to write them, it would not suffice. So the Quran itself basically says, hey, what you have in front of you here and what you're reading here is definitely not everything there is, you know? And the Prophet himself also said this, you know, when he told us that we shall seek knowledge, and even if we had to go to China for that. If we as Muslims would take that seriously, we would have to seek knowledge probably from Buddhism and Confucianism and Taoism, and maybe even from the Communist Party in China, and from many other, you know, sources, if we would understand this hadith in a literal way. This general idea is very present both in the Quran and in hadith, and it's very much stressed throughout the thinking of classical Muslim thinkers, that you can find knowledge and you can find revelation everywhere, and it is not limited by so-called scripture at all. And Muslims in the past, as far at least as they understood themselves as knowledgeable of their religion, were very much aware of that. And they knew that as human beings, we are complicated, and as human beings we have different approaches inside of us, sometimes to the same thing. We cannot necessarily, if we relate to something, for example a sexual act, yes, we can relate to that sexual act by reading up on it in scripture, but we also have maybe a knowledge on that in our heart. We have experiences shared by our friends. We have science, for example. You know, Muslim scholars in the past were very much interested in what, for example, doctors had to say on certain subjects, philosophers had to say on certain subjects. And it was not rare to, you know, for Muslim scholars in the past to be doctors themselves and to be philosophers themselves. If we look at the big names in Muslim history, names like Ibn Sina, for example, Ibn Sina was a scholar of Islamic law. At the same time, he was a scholar of medicine. At the same time, he was a scholar of Neoplatonist philosophy. And his ideas were informed by all of that. And he was very aware of that not always you can reconcile everything with everything, but it always teaches you something. And whatever it teaches, it comes from truth, because you cannot divide truth. You cannot say, this is the Quran, and this is rationality, and this is my heart. In the end, it's all pointing towards truth. I'm amazed I actually made my basic points already. Yeah, I would like to open the floor to all of you and invite you for a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leyla. That was really, really nice to hear. I really enjoyed listening to your train of thought and how you kind of talk about the historical development of how kind of personally people's experience of Islam as how they see it, from kind of seeing it today, where people are focused on law and maybe thinking of and actually whether historically there was a more openness to the focus at the heart of it, which is how we are with each other, and a drawing on our own personal experience of being with other people, as I understand from what you're talking about.
Just a short note to that, because of course, I'm aware of the fact that yes, we can. If we look at the past as well, we can also find, other approaches to Islam. Of course, like when we look at movements nowadays that we brand as Wahhabism, for example, a lot of them look back to a guy called Ibn Taymiyyah, who had formulated some ideas that they can base themselves on. So it's not, of course, that every Muslim in the past was just cool and relaxed and thought about, oh, what's in my heart. That's not the point. But in general, the idea that you cannot claim to possess every and all knowledge on truth, and that there is a multiplicity of truth that you have to negotiate. That is something that was very prominent in the past, definitely, and that people dealt with, and that we have forgotten nowadays to a large extent.
But I think it goes against what often is seen as the straight road of progress from the past in which everything was kind of terrible, and now we're kind of liberating, and some of the ideas even that we at IMI often pinpointed as being like, the good face of Islam, bringing kind of new ideas, but actually some of those ideas are very conservative ideas of, I'm not saying that the past or today is perfect and all of the things were existing. But I think it was just making me think about, a bit of the conversation we were having before about thinking about in my everyday life, and how I, working with families who are really caught not just in the idea of Islam as a place full of laws, but also a place full of cultural laws. They're not necessarily, even if you talk to a family who's struggling with their child's gender or sexuality, they're coming back to, but my father, but my auntie would say this, that my people would say this, but at the mosque I would be shunned, but I would be treated this way, that people feel that they're not going back to what's maybe at their heart. And if you actually, as you were talking about, if you ask people, what does your Islam mean to you, really, when you really ask and keep asking, that it usually does mean about how we can love each other more and how we can be connected more. And I wondered whether you felt that the part of probably a broader scheme of how we get an Islam that isn't so focused around law, or how we develop and allow these other ways of seeing what it is to be Muslim to be broader and not to be so small, and therefore create freedoms for people? Do you feel it is partly about bringing the heart back to it and about allowing the plurality of different ideas to be part of the core of what it means?
Yeah, I mean, you said create, but I think to a great extent is remembering, remembering what we have in Islamic cultures, what approaches have been there. Because it's all there, but people have lost access to that. And I've made this experience in my work actually a couple of times, that if you actually remind families, for example, who struggle with these kind of things, have you never heard this kind of sentence, that hurting a human heart is worse than not doing your Hajj or something like that? A lot of them will say, yeah, my grandmother always used to say that, I mean, the knowledge is still there, but it's so covered under these thick layers of, on the one hand, politicized, but also, I would even say pathologized kind of practical thinking on Islam. But people still know it; it's still there, and even if they do not know it, uncovering it is actually not that much work, especially not with all the sources and resources that we have nowadays.
So, what do you think is the blockage that's stopping it from that knowledge being connected up to today?
I don't. I mean, we can talk a lot about who's controlling Islamic knowledge production in our days and who is not controlling it. And of course that has an influence. Who is speaking in the mosques, who is pouring money into the mosque and so on. Definitely that is an influence. And as Ghazala also pointed out this morning, it's mostly about power. It's a power game that's played out there. But in the end, I feel the actual reasons for these struggles are not so much religious reasons, but have much more to do with, for example, the economic positioning of migrant families in the West, or in general also the situation of the Muslim world, political problems, all of that, and that makes people very fearful, and people retreat to very strict essentializing and identitarian positions. I mean, we see it overall everywhere in the world, not only amongst Muslims, this rise of essentializing fundamentalist nationalist positions. We see it in all contexts nowadays. And I think it's in many cases, I mean, I appreciate the work a lot that some of us are doing here, working through the Quran, working through sources, trying to resolve issues. And all of that is important because it also gives us access to knowledge. But I think we also need to do more work on how to build an inner resilience in our communities towards all these other daily struggles that we face. Because when we feel more secure, then we are also able to love. If you don't feel secure, then you cannot love. I think it's as simple as that in the end.
Thank you. I'd like to try and open up to everybody. I think I'll take 3 questions from the audience again, and then once we've collected the questions, then you can respond.
Thank you, Leyla, for a very inspiring and thought-provoking discussion and talk. I just wondered whether you feel optimistic or positive about the future of the Muslim communities globally in terms of embracing plurality and critical thinking, and whether you felt that really we have a long way to go in terms of understanding the diversity within our communities.
I mean, it definitely has become so much better already. I mean, just sitting in an environment such as this one here and being able to discuss sexuality and gender in a more open way already says a lot. You know, I mean, I'm always shocked a little bit myself when it is mentioned, but you mentioned that I'm an activist for 20 years. So, like, basically 2 decades ago, I started to deal with my own gender identity and my own sexuality, and there was nothing like that in Europe, in the Western diaspora, that I could hold on to. And I mean, I had to, you know, I've spoken about my story at other places and written about it as well, that, you know, at some point I went to India and I became a part of the Hijra community there, and then went to Pakistan. You know, I had to go to the other end of the globe basically to find some kind of community and to find some positive knowledge informing me on my sexuality and gender identity. Now we have spaces like this, we have communities growing all over the world, we have a lot of people who work on uncovering hidden and lost heritage, positive heritage, embracing heritage in the Muslim world. So yeah, I think we're on a good way. Of course, the general circumstances will tell how far we can go with this. And we see in this world nowadays as well a lot of other things happen that complicate it. You know, the political situation everywhere does not look too good, but there are a lot of good people looking at a lot of good things, and I think in general as believers we have to have hope. We have to believe, we have to I mean, whether you understand this as just as a symbol or as a reality, but we have all these ideas in our faith of the Mahdi coming, of Isa coming back at some point, you know, and these stories are actually meant to remind us there is always hope. There will come a better world at some point, and it's always good to hold on to that idea.
Thank you, Leyla. That was fantastic. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about non-binary identity in Muslim history. It'd be really unfair to ask you for another story because that first story was brilliant, but maybe like some thoughts about how maybe like non-binary identity comes up in Islamic history, because I think that's something that often when you're talking to people in this country or people in sort of like a global north perspective, you talk about that Hijra community, but it'd be interesting to think about sort of historical perspectives as well.
Should we take one more question?
I'm interested to know where you think your work is going next and the next stages on this subject area, and what you see the future could bring. So it's a multiple part question, I'm sorry. So where does it go next? Where are the challenges and where is the hope in the next stages of your work and this topic area?
Should we take one more question and then...
We can do this round first.
Thanks, and yeah, really excellent talk, thank you. I just wanted to ask, so it's really great to have a sort of space like this in IMI where we can have discussions and sort of think about ideas that sort of challenge conventional wisdom in more traditional circles in Muslim communities. But when I've had sort of similar discussions with those communities, often an argument I hear back is that particularly in Islam, sort of moral principles are based on, you know, sort of Islamic laws and on that we live in a time where we don't have a overall leader like the Prophet, where we can say this is right and this is wrong. We only have the principles of that they left behind, so that we should put our faith when it comes to moral and ethical issues in those who are experts and those who are knowledgeable, you know, and the sort of schools of wisdom and marja and things like that, and that there isn't a place in Islam for sort of laissez-faire morality, where we're sort of having discussion that's determined by which isn't a position that I sit with, but it's an argument you often hear. And strictly from an Islamic perspective, that's often something that's discussed. And I just didn't know what your position on that, or what kind of how to take a discussion further from there. I just didn't know if you had a view on that.
Okay, thank you very much for this question. I'm going to work backwards, and maybe did you make notes or anything, or maybe I have to ask you again what you said. I mean this has been a big debate in within the last 100, 200 years. The question of taqlid, and should we follow the scholars or should we not follow the scholars. I feel that we need a new discussion on what scholar means, what alim means a knowledgeable person. And we have to admit that a lot of the people that are called scholars nowadays, there are some very, very excellent people out there, definitely. But there are also a lot of people that maybe do not really deserve the title of a knowledgeable person, and especially with regards to what I mentioned before, when we look at the classical period in Islam, where scholars were often what we call Renaissance men, who were educated in all kinds of different fields. I mean, imagine we had people like that nowadays. Imagine we had religious scholars who would also have an actual, for example, medical knowledge on gender and sexuality, on the, all the kinds of chromosome and hormone combinations that exist in human beings, for example. Such scholars would rule completely differently on sexuality and gender than a lot of the scholars that we have nowadays. So in many cases, I think we can judge pretty well if the person that is called a scholar really has such a circumspect knowledge that they can tell us something about things. So I wish we had a real reform of education in Islam where we could take these things into account. I'm not one of these people who will say that following scholars is bad and we all have to go back to the scriptures or just the Quran or something like that, because I think in the end it's not about that. If I look at the world, it doesn't really, I mean, there are Sunnis who are assholes and there are Sunnis who are nice people. There are Shiis who are assholes and there are Shiis who are nice people. There are Ahle Hadith who are assholes and some who are nice people, and the same with Quran only people. Some are assholes, some are not. So apparently that is really not the big factor, but there is something else there that's important. I would again say that it's actually the heart that it's important. Tamsila, where my work will lead to, I mean, if you ask me personally, I'm actually retiring right now. I'm like, I don't want to. But I mean, what I see is there's a lot of stuff emerging right now, and I'm very excited about that stuff. I mean, just before I came here, I was very busy in Germany as well with the Queer Festival Heidelberg, and we had my friend Kami from Karachi over, Kami Sid, who is a very popular trans model and trans activist from Karachi, and we did events with her. And there was another activist from Tunisia, and there was another activist, a Turkish-Austrian activist, and we put them all together and discussed with them. And a lot of stuff like that is happening right now, that you have this global networking, these global solidarities emerging, people, Muslim trans people here in the West interested in the communities, the Khaja Sara community in Pakistan, the Hijra community in India. On the other hand, the people there are interested in the transgender activism here. So these are things, again, that didn't exist just a few years ago, and they are just starting right now. These kind of alliances are just built right now, and I'm sure a lot of awesome stuff will come out of that. I'm not going to predict what exactly, but yeah, something will come. Non-binary. Yeah, I mean, it depends on what you define as non-binary. You know, there are very different ideas of what it means. Obviously, if we talk about South Asian traditional trans communities, you could say they are non-binary because they work on the framework of three genders. They understand themselves as a third gender. So it's non-binary. The modern Western idea of being non-binary is often much more fluid, you know, because actually being a Khajasara or being a Hijra is still very much tied to certain normativities. You know, you're supposed to be a certain character, you're supposed to behave in a certain way, follow certain rules, certain ideas. It's not this entire fluidity that is played out in that field. But on the other hand, I also, you know, I sometimes don't like the way that when we look at so-called traditional cultures, we often focus on the cultural, like the social pressure that is there and that creates certain subjectivities. Typical example for me is always there's this phenomenon in Afghanistan of bachaposhi, of girls performing male roles to earn money for their families. And the analysis is often this, oh yeah, these are very patriarchal societies, and you know, and the girls cannot earn money otherwise, and they have to adopt a male role to do this. While if we had something similar in the West, we would say, oh, this person has just has just discovered his or her own authentic self and is now living as a free trans man or something like that, you know? In reality, I think it's far more complex because in every society we have social constraints, we have social pressure, and in every society we also have individuals trying to deal with these social constraints and making their way. And of course, the rise of non-binary identities in the West is also very much tied to the way we in the West have constructed gender for a long time. And even if we ideally think of non-binary identities as very fluid and very, you know, flexible, in practice we are also very much tied to the general social framework, and actually we are not non-binary identities are still struggling a lot with. I mean, there is no social framework in the West, in Western countries, for non-binary identities at all. So I don't want to offend anybody in the audience who might identify as non-binary, but what I mean to say is that even being non-binary in the West is still a project in process. It is an idea that has been developed by activists very recently, and we will see where it will go.
So I have two things. One thing I want to say in response to the question about who holds the knowledge, and I think, and who do we listen to? And I think one of the things that I find really compelling about IMI is the idea that it tries to democratize knowledge production, and that we can all be creators of knowledge. And so even in the Jummas that we hold, it's open to anyone potentially to kind of to hold that space and to share the knowledge that they have. And I think it's a really powerful thing, and that's what we're doing in this space as well, encouraging people to contribute on the wall, because we can all be tellers of our own stories, and we can tell stories of our communities, and it honors the fact that just even within our own bodies we hold knowledge, and that's acceptable and celebrated and platformed. So that's one point. But the other is a question about how you talked a little bit about power, in who is telling the narratives about Islam. And I think one of the things, particularly in this country, that we're contending with is the fact that actually the state is writing a lot of what Islam is supposed to be. So, I mean, there are even kind of internal documents that have specifically talked about, for example, Ibn Arabi as a more preferable person to follow, you know. So there's actual reference to theology and the state writing that as an acceptable practice of Islam. So how do we, as we are trying to kind of recall, like you suggest, how do we also kind of fortify ourselves against this kind of the state project of trying to create a good, bad Muslim dichotomy? Sorry, that was really long.
Are there any other questions? Okay. Well, I was just thinking about that, just adding to your question, because it just came into my head about thinking about maybe this is partly what you're saying as well, just that sometimes whether plurality or trying to present a plurality of views of Islam can become a weakness in resistance to the ways in which people want to kind of narrow it. If that makes any sense.
Yeah, that's a tough one, actually. I mean, the thing is that this rewriting, this retelling of the narrative by the state is in many ways just a mirror image of what was done earlier in the colonial period, where the colonial state was also writing what Islam was supposed to be, you know, and that has affected Muslim communities a lot, you know, where like Western scholars were, you know, making assumptions about what real Islam is and what not real Islam is, and that Sufism is not real Islam, but it's actually just Islam mixed with Hinduism or whatever, you know. And now we're suddenly entering a new phase in which Western state authorities want to tell us that, well, as you just mentioned, well, better go back to Ibn Arabi and stop being a Deobandi, for example, or something like this, you know, which is something very different from accepting the multiplicity of views, you know. Because you would not in that kind of project, you would also not have an Abu Nuwas who at the same time is a hadith teacher. You would have an Abu Nuwas who just is a homoerotic poet, you know. I think the only thing we can do is to constantly resist playing into the hands of these kind of narratives, and it's not easy because we are fighting at two fronts. We are fighting, fighting sounds very martial, but we are fighting within our communities for more acceptance and for change, and at the same time we are fighting in mainstream society against Islamophobia and racism and all of that. And it happens quite frequently that mainstream politics and mainstream society takes something that we have said in a specific context and uses it for their own purposes. We cannot prevent that. I think that's just how the world that we live in is built. We have to realize that, and we can only always resist. And I think we really have to be very careful with state actors, because we have this. I mean, your organization has this issue the same way that my organization has this issue, that the state comes and says, yeah, here we have money for you, or maybe not the state, but some other actors. Here we have money for you, but then they expect us to use that money in the way that they would like to see us use it. I really always try to stay away from any political involvement, like political in the sense of the upper layers of politics, the hierarchical, what you call this, the elites. That at the same time, of course, means not having enough money, you know, and not being supported enough. But that is the price that we have to pay, I think, to stay authentic.
There's 2 questions at the back.
Hi, thank you for your talk. It was really good. I know a lot of Muslims who can't really understand the importance of pushing for a more diverse and accepting version of Islam, in a sense, when it comes to gender expressions and sexuality, because in their opinion there are more important things to focus on. So how do I convince them to change their minds?
Well, it's like, I mean, yeah, obviously it's not important to you if it doesn't concern you, you know? But I don't think that is a very Islamic position to take, because as Muslims we are called to defend the Mazlumin, and it doesn't say, oh, please only defend them when it's a number over 50 or a number over 100, you know. If it's one single person that's suffering and that has a struggle, then as a Muslim you're supposed to be interested in that struggle and to deal with it. It's a very simple thing, actually.
I just wanted to maybe continue some of that conversation I think a few people have brought up around the idea of, and sort of what I think Lena was saying, of what we're trying to sort of move towards this more open-ended, more heart-based understanding of Islam, while at the same time having these other influences from within and from without the community, also seeing that narrative and seeing it as a positive thing. And I was wondering your thoughts on one example of this phenomenon I found at least in the Muslim communities in which I was a part of in the US, was sort of this return to sort of pseudo-orthodoxy, but particularly the idea of perennialism becoming a bad word. So anytime you would have these kind of lateral or more mystical interpretations of something, which, as you yourself pointed out, has a long tradition within the history and the community and everything, this sort of using that idea of like, oh, this is just perennialism. All you're doing is this endless, reinterpreting however you want, and so on. And I wonder, is there a way to think about, that third path of sort of how do we craft a perennial? Because in my mind, I mean, this is not a word everyone uses, but in that sense of the perennialist, in the sense of always returning back to a sort of a common source of a common, heart or purpose, that at the same time is militant, at the same time is sort of part of a vital subculture, but without falling prey to these dichotomies of, like Lena and others were bringing up of good Muslim, bad Muslim, and all these things. I guess maybe what I'm trying to ask is, have you also seen this in scholarship or in your experience of sort of the people even using language like decoloniality and things like this, but in order using whole frameworks invented by sort of like queer and non-binary communities, but then to sort of rubber band back and attack the very concepts and say, oh, this is actually, this is somehow a liberal concept and you are just a perennialist and really we need to return to the source, which is this other thing. How do we, is it a discursive thing? Is it about the spaces we build, sort of revive the idea that, yeah, it's a good thing actually. We're reviving a constant, an old tradition. I guess that's.
Yeah, I mean, there has been a big trend recently of using the word of tradition to silence people, to say, oh, this is not the tradition, this is not the tradition, this is not the tradition. And it really, honestly, personally, pisses me off, because who defines what is the tradition and what not? Is the Khaja Sara community not traditional? It's centuries old, it's a tradition. Is the poetry of Yunus Emre, is that not part of tradition? Of course it's part of tradition. Is, I don't know if you go to Sufi shrines, let's go to Sevan, the shrine of Lal Shahbaz Qalandar, and you have people smoking weed and dancing around naked. That is tradition, that's pretty old. It's a pretty old tradition, So this strange notion of tradition that has been breeded by a certain group of people it's just not consistent, It's a very, I mean, these kind of people will tell you, oh, you just do cherry picking, but they do the best cherry picking of all, because they cut, tradition in a very, very narrow way and say, okay, this is tradition, that is not tradition, this is tradition, that is not tradition. I guess we will always have these people around, and there's not much to do to convince them otherwise. Let them do their stuff, and just get together with people who give you a better feeling. I think that's all one can do, basically. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that. That was. I really love I think we were talking earlier about, I really love just always coming back to bringing it back to the heart, and looking after ourselves and looking after each other, and that being the core of what drives, my Islam. I don't know, again, I think it's important that other people have their own center of what their Islam means for them as well. But it's just been so interesting hearing from you, and I'm really glad. It's great to have the conversation and discussion, which I've been longing for here at ME for so long. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.